Welcome back, you guys, to another deep dive into To Kill a Mockingbird.
It's great to be back.
Glad to have you. We are moving right along in the book, and we're at chapter 13 now.
Exciting stuff.
Yeah, and this is a pretty pivotal chapter, I feel like, because things start to shift a little bit. We've seen Scout navigating school and the mysteries of Boo Radley.
Right.
But now a new dynamic is introduced into her life, and it kind of shakes things up a bit in the Finch household.
It does indeed. A new character enters the scene, and she kind of comes in like a storm.
She really does. It's like a whirlwind, right?
A whirlwind.
Aunt Alexandra.
Yeah.
It's such a dramatic entrance, the way Lee describes her arrival, that heavy suitcase hitting the floor with a dull permanence.
Yeah.
It's like, oh boy, this is going to be a big change.
Yeah, you get that sense of foreboding right away, like something's about to shift in the atmosphere of the house.
Absolutely. And, up until now, Atticus has been both mom and dad, pretty much,
Right.
So it's like throwing a wrench in the works a little bit.
It really is, and you see this reflected in Jem and Scout's reaction to their aunt's arrival. They're so not used to having this kind of formal, traditional presence in their lives. They're used to running wild, being free-spirited, and suddenly they have this aunt who's all about propriety and decorum.
Right. Remember how Scout describes Aunt Alexandra's corset?
Oh, yes, that Sunday corset.
Yeah, like it was a symbol.
Yeah, it's almost like a physical representation of how Aunt Alexandra wants to constrict and mold Scout into this very specific image of what a young lady should be.
Yeah, that's a great point. And she doesn't waste any time, getting involved in Maycomb society.
Oh, she jumps right in.
She's receiving lane cakes from Miss Maudie. She's involved with the Missionary Society.
She's attending all the social gatherings, the Maycomb Amanuensis Club.
It's remarkable how quickly she becomes a fixture, like she's been there all along.
She fits in seamlessly with Maycomb's social circles.
Yet she can't seem to fit into Jem and Scout's world.
Right, it's like there's this disconnect there.
She just doesn't quite understand their dynamic.
And this really becomes clear when she starts talking about, fine folks.
Oh, yeah.
This is where that clash of perspectives really comes to the forefront.
Right. Her whole belief system seems to revolve around lineage and how long a family has lived on their land, upholding these traditional Southern values.
It's important to remember the historical context here. We're talking about the Deep South in the 1930s.
Right.
So family names, social standing, all of that carried a lot of weight back then.
Oh, absolutely. And it's fascinating how Lee uses Aunt Alexandra to really embody that mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And then she even uses the Ewells as an example.
Oh, yes. The Ewell's always good for an example.
Right. To illustrate her point about good breeding, but it feels a little ironic, doesn't it?
It does a bit because, they're this dysfunctional family, but they've been in Maycomb for generations.
Right.
And, by her logic, that should give them some level of standing.
Exactly. So it really exposes this hypocrisy, of this whole social hierarchy. And speaking of irony, I love how Lee throws in that story about Sinkfield, the founder of Maycomb.
Oh, yes. The clever innkeeper.
Right.
Who managed to outsmart the surveyors.
He redrew the county lines to benefit his business.
Right.
So he's like the ultimate pragmatist.
And it really undercuts Alexandra's whole notion of, fine folks having this inherent virtue.
Right. He was all about profit.
Yeah.
And really, he was the one who shaped Maycomb.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like this subtle critique of her ideas.
Yes. And it leads perfectly into Scout's description of the Maycomb caste system.
Yes. This is one of my favorite parts of the chapter.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
So fascinating.
To see this social hierarchy laid out from a child's perspective.
It's like an anthropological study.
It really is.
She breaks down all the families and their perceived characteristics.
Yeah, like the Crawfords who can't mind their own business.
Right.
Or the Penfield women who are considered flighty.
It's like everyone's in a box.
Everyone's categorized and judged based on their family name.
And I think it's so clever how Lee uses Scout's innocence to kind of highlight the absurdity of it all.
Yeah, because she's describing it so earnestly,
right?
But at the same time, you can see the silliness of these judgments.
Yes. And this scene really sets the stage for that pivotal moment when Aunt Alexandra decides to give Jem and Scout a lesson in gentle breeding.
Oh, yes, the infamous cousin Joshua.
Right, she's using him as an example.
A shining example of their lineage.
And then it backfires spectacularly when Jem reveals that cousin Joshua tried to shoot the university president.
It's such a great moment.
It's so funny.
It's like a pinprick to her carefully constructed bubble of family pride.
It really is. And poor Atticus is caught right in the middle of this,
Yeah.
trying to explain his sister's perspective to his children.
But he looks so uncomfortable.
He really does.
Like, he doesn't agree with what she's saying.
It's one of the few times we see Atticus struggling.
Right.
He's usually so calm and collected, but he's really conflicted here.
He's torn between family loyalty and his own more progressive beliefs.
You can feel the tension building in that scene, and Scout picks up on it.
Oh, yes. Scout's very perceptive.
Oh, she is, and it's kind of heartbreaking to see her start to cry.
It is. It's like she's feeling a distance from her father for the first time.
Right, like she's losing that connection. And it's all because of this pressure that Aunt Alexandra is bringing into their lives.
Yeah, this pressure to conform to these societal expectations.
But then Atticus does something really important.
Yes.
He rejects Aunt Alexandra's rigid ideas. He reassures Scout that everything is okay. And he even makes a joke about Cousin Joshua to lighten the mood.
It's such a beautiful moment.
It really is.
Because you see Atticus reclaiming his genuine self.
Yes.
The father who values compassion and understanding above all else.
It's a powerful affirmation of his character. And it really speaks to the heart of the novel, I think.
Absolutely. And it leaves us wondering how this whole dynamic with Aunt Alexandra will continue to play out.
Yeah, how will it impact Scout's understanding of the world and her place in it?
It's a really intriguing setup for what's to come.
It is, and I think it's going to be fascinating to explore that further in the next part of our deep dive.
I can't wait.
All right, well, stay tuned, folks, because there's a lot more to uncover in Chapter 13.
A lot more.
We'll be right back after a quick break. It's like a storm's brewing in the Finch household.
Oh, it is. And I think for Scout, it's especially challenging because she's now being forced to confront these societal expectations head on.
Right up until now, she's been free to be herself, running around with Jem, getting dirty, exploring the world without too much concern for what people think.
Exactly. And suddenly an Alexandra arrives with this whole new set of rules.
And expectations.
Yes, she's suddenly being told to act like a lady.
Which in Aunt Alexandra's mind
means conforming to very specific behaviors, appearances.
I mean, just think about the corset.
Exactly. The corset becomes this symbol of those expectations.
Right. And for Scout, this vibrant, independent spirit, it just feels suffocating.
Oh, absolutely. She's a tomboy at heart.
Right. She doesn't understand why she can't just be comfortable.
Do the things she enjoys.
And you know what? This is something I think a lot of us can relate to.
I think so, too.
Regardless of whether we've had an overbearing aunt.
We've all felt that pressure to fit in, to meet certain expectations.
From family, friends, society.
Absolutely. And it's through Scout's struggles that we see the universality of this experience.
It's really true. And Lee does such a good job of portraying Atticus caught in the middle of all this.
Oh, yes. Poor Atticus.
He's trying to balance his sister's expectations with his own more progressive values.
And his understanding of Scout's personality.
Exactly. He represents this more open-minded, accepting perspective.
But he's also bound by these family ties and the social conventions of his time.
It's tough, right?
It's a difficult position to be in, for sure.
Yeah, and Lee captures that internal conflict beautifully.
She does.
But even amidst all this tension, she manages to inject humor into the story. I mean, that scene where Jem blurts out about Cousin Joshua trying to shoot the university president.
Oh, that's classic.
It's hilarious.
It's such a well-timed moment of comic relief.
Yeah, it comes at the perfect moment to diffuse the tension.
And it highlights that balance that Lee strikes so well.
Between humor and these heavier themes.
Of social prejudice, family conflict.
Exactly, and she always manages to bring it back to this kind of childhood innocence.
That's what makes the story so engaging and relatable, even when dealing with these complex ideas.
It's really true.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that makes To Kill a Mockingbird so timeless.
Absolutely.
But going back to the serious side for a moment, I think this chapter raises an important question for us as readers, or in this case, listeners.
What's that?
How will Scout navigate this new dynamic with Aunt Alexandra?
Ooh, good question.
Will she succumb to the pressure to conform? Or will she stay true to herself?
Right, because up to this point, her understanding of, what it means to be a good person has been shaped primarily by Atticus.
And now she's being presented with this completely different perspective.
And that's what makes it so compelling, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like she's caught between these two moral compasses.
And as we continue our deep dives, it'll be fascinating to watch how she reconciles those competing viewpoints.
How she develops her own sense of right and wrong.
Exactly.
I mean, there's just so much packed into this chapter.
There is.
Makes me think back to my own childhood. Those pressures to fit in.
I wonder if our listeners are having similar reflections.
I bet they are. I think that's the power of great literature.
It allows us to connect with these universal human experiences.
Even if the details of our lives are different.
Exactly. It's a shared human experience.
We've been talking about Scout and Aunt Alexandra, and their different ideas about what it means to be a fine person.
Right, and it really gets you thinking, doesn't it? What does it actually mean?
Because Aunt Alexandra clearly has a very specific definition.
Yeah, she's all about lineage and appearances and upholding those traditional make-home values.
But is that really all there is to it?
I think Lee is subtly challenging that definition throughout the novel.
Right, we see that in Atticus.
Yes, Atticus is a perfect example.
He's not concerned with those superficial things.
No, he prioritizes compassion and empathy.
Doing what's right, even when it's unpopular.
Exactly. He embodies a different kind of fine person.
One that goes beyond social standing or family name.
And that contrast between him and Aunt Alexandra is so important for Scout.
Right, because she's trying to figure out her own values.
It's like she's caught between these two moral compasses.
And I think that's something our listeners can relate to.
Oh, absolutely.
We all face pressure to conform.
Whether it's from family, friends, or society in general.
And I think this chapter reminds us that true growth comes from questioning those expectations.
Defining our own values.
It's about having the courage to be yourself.
Even when it's hard.
Even when it goes against the grain.
And just like Scout, we have to figure out what kind of people we want to be.
Regardless of family history or social standing.
And as we continue reading To Kill a Mockingbird,
It'll be fascinating to see how Scout navigates these pressures.
how she learns to define her own sense of right and wrong.
Independent of what Aunt Alexandra or even Atticus might believe.
It's the beginning of her real coming-of-age journey.
A journey that will challenge her beliefs.
Force her to confront the complexities of prejudiced justice and what it really means to be a good person.
In a world that often rewards appearances over substance.
Well said.
This has been such a great discussion.
I agree.
I feel like we've really uncovered some important insights about Chapter 13.
Family secrets.
Macomb's rigid social hierarchy.
The true meaning of being a fine person.
And I hope our listeners will carry these insights with them.
As they continue reading.
Because the themes introduced in this chapter will definitely continue to resonate.
They will.
Before we wrap up, I have one final thought-provoking question for our listeners.
Okay. I'm ready.
Is it more important to be well-bred or to simply be good?
That's a good one.
It's something to think about.
Not just in the context of the novel, but in our own lives as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Chapter 13 of To Kill a Mockingbird.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll be back soon with another exploration of Harper Lee's masterpiece.
Can't wait.
Until then, keep those pages turning.